My name is Erin Hoffman-John, and this is a quest for meaning in the dark age of middle information. I want to thank Siege and Andrew Greenberg in particular for inviting me back to the conference, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you all during the Q&A session after this video, or maybe during it, because 2020 is wild. I hope you're all staying as safe and well as possible during this very pivotal year. You might know from your history classes in school that Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, and this kicked off a series of events that ultimately led to the Enlightenment in Europe. But if you're like me, you either never knew or have long forgotten that the distance between these two events was about 300 years, and not just any years, 300 years of war. The printing press wasn't coincidental with these events. It was a simple, pivotal event that kicked off radical system change that echoes today. And if you're asking, as you should, was this just Europe? No, it wasn't. Print had similar effects everywhere else it was introduced, catalyzing massive political change. I'm a systems designer, and from a systems lens, it was one of the most breathtaking advances in the history of humanity. By democratizing the consumption, creation, and dissemination of information, the printing press created the middle class in Europe by broadening access to education, upended the control of religious leaders, destabilizing churches across the continent, destroyed some leaders and created new ones, from the local to the international. I believe that it would be fair to characterize humans before print as one species and humans after print as another. We'll talk about this more in a minute, and what it has to do with video games later, but I suppose I should introduce myself. As I said, my name is Erin Hoffman-John, and my last appearance at Siege was in 2015. That was 2 babies ago to me. My second was born just a couple of months ago. So if I were less sleep deprived, I might be able to think about whether or not I feel like I'm the same person who spoke to you then, but maybe it's just as well I can't. At any rate, I'm on baby bonding leave, and so when Andrew reached out to ask if I would like to speak again and about what, I couldn't help but kick out what's been on my mind. Just what the heck is happening to not just our American society, but to societies all over the world, what it means, and what we should do. If you want my game credentials, my story goes a little like this. I once wrote a very scathing letter to the editor in high school. I was a top English student and by then already a trained shit disturber. Right around the same time, I was binge reading every fantasy and science fiction novel I could get my hands on and started participating in writing/role-playing groups on the internet. Not writing/, that's different, especially on America Online. Because I was a shit disturber, I was dissatisfied with the options available to me, and I started writing my own writing/role-playing group, which over the next few years grew to about 50 people spread around the country. For this, I had to invent a world, create the role-playing rules, and then nurture the community that generated literally millions of words in this world over the next few years. It turns out this was pretty good training for a certain kind of game design, and after I binge-played a game called Dragon Realms for a couple of years, I found an opening to work on the game as a designer and got hired. I apprenticed in game design with some amazing folk at that company throughout college, landed one of the first IGDA GDC scholarships, and at my first GDC got a shit-paying QA job in Southern California, one of those ones where the salary was below the minimum wage equivalent. I was living the dream, and my parents were sort of horrified by my dreams back then. Fast forward about 17 years, yikes, and I've been working on games for PS2, Xbox, Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, and PC, including a virtual world startup, a kids virtual world, and the Facebook Canvas. I started a company called Sense of Wonder and produced multiple mobile games, one of which won an Indie Award, and I worked for an educational nonprofit called Glass Lab, where I designed educational video games that also won some awards. In December, I'll return to my current gig doing creative research and development for Google. There's nothing quite like having a kid during a pandemic and then taking a big step back from work to make you examine both the choices you've made in your life and also where you might be going in the future. Because I have just enough of a philosophy background to be dangerous, I started thinking about what meaning even is, and how you create it, and how your life itself can be meaningful. That got me on a track to catching up on some Heidegger, but don't worry, I narrowly avoided making this talk about Dasein. Number 1, I'm utterly unqualified, and number 2, I found out we aren't entirely sure Heidegger wasn't a Nazi, and that's just not something I have the emotional bandwidth for these days. Instead, I circled back to something more timely and something I've given a lot of thought to over the years. We only create meaning in our present time, and right now, if you recall, we're living in the information age. But what does it mean to live in the information age? It's one of those things we accept without often examining. To think about this, it's useful to consider the history of information and its significance to humanity. I want to posit that as game developers, we are information workers. This has become especially clear to me after 3 years at Google. So we should be concerned about the history and definition of information. If you look at this secondary OED definition of information, we could talk about the first one, talk about what is a fact, but let's not. You can see how the notion of information kind of blurs the closer you stare at it. What is conveyed or represented by a particular arrangement or sequence of things. But this is actually a very accurate definition of what information is. Information isn't just a fact or a piece of knowledge. It's how and when and why it is conveyed. Information is multidimensional, and things like context, ordering, relative positioning matter. There is a curation quality built into the definition of information. This was true even in the early history of what information was to our species, which arguably was our core distinguishing characteristic, our ability to communicate information through language, especially across generations. But there is a tiger in the forest carries a vastly different significance depending on how close you are to the forest. We think of information as simple, but it's really, really not, partly because so little of it is processed by our conscious minds. And then speed of transmission matters. The printing press was a huge deal because although Europe had written language thousands of years before it, and even had books in the early medieval period, some 700 years before the printing press, those books could only be produced by a small number of people, and therefore only read by a not much larger number of people, and they were costly and rare. This is why you see radical paradigm changes with the printing press, which produced an estimated 20 million volumes in its first 60 years of operation. Woodblock printing had a similar effect across Asia, and all around the world, when you have rapid print, you have war and new religious movements that sweep through nations like wildfire, such as in East Asia, where Buddhism carried print technology across the region. As a populist religion, Buddhist texts in China were written in vernacular rather than literary Chinese, a perfect mix for the populist-friendly printing technologies, similar to the way the printing press, in seeking wider audiences, prompted the translation of the Bible from Latin into German, English, and other commonly spoken European languages. The liberation of literacy in combination with the printing press unlocks access to information, both its consumption and its creation and modification across massive new populations. The 14th century was a fascinating time, and famous historian Barbara Tuchman wrote a book called A Distant Mirror, in which she posited that we are living through another kind of iteration of the 14th century, with its nationalism, religious wars, pestilence, and climate disruption. Some of this may be coincidental, the climate disruption certainly, but the comparisons are pretty eerie. The printing press really arrived in the mid-15th century, but it dramatically accelerated the disrupted Europe already destabilized by these earlier dynamics. In addition to giving rise to the middle class by democratizing access to education, which is, we should be clear, not just access to information, but access to the knowledge of how to organize and parse information. This is crucial. The printing press also gave rise to a period of intense nationalism, because various regions could now communicate and recognize the differences in their cultures. This was nationalization, bred of a visibility into the nature of other cultures and minds that led to war, in combination with that information's access's unmooring of trust in authority figures such as church and state. And I have to say again, because it is just so mind-blowing, this lasted for 300 years. Note also that if we fast forward just a little to the 16th century, you see another iteration of impact, and this in the Enlightenment. The podcast Throughline back in March of last year had a beautiful presentation of the connection between this time of religious and political instability and ours in its episode called American Shadows. We think of conspiracy theories as a rising novel problem, but these theories, the purest form of fake news, arguably powered the American Revolution. It was a time of carefully choreographed propaganda intended to deliberately destabilize the colonies and nudge them towards revolution, and it largely depended on pamphlets distributed by people like Samuel Adams. Without the printmakers of the time, it is not at all clear that the revolution, and thus the United States as a country, ever even happens. This is the printing press and its impact on information, again warping the space of society, all having to do with the rapid, arguably out of control, dissemination of information. I think about this kind of thing a lot because I've worked in research and development for the past 6 years or so. To ascribe such massive change to a single technology is staggering and says a lot about what it means to strategize with technology for social change. It also says a lot about the way that every technology of this significant scope cannot help but destabilize society, and the more significant the technology, the more dramatic the destabilization. Consider then that the internet has been called the most significant invention since the printing press. How does it change your thinking to imagine that you are living in a new 14th century, the peak of a new dark age? The printing press, as you might recall, produced 20 million volumes in 60 years in Europe. The internet, between the year 2000 and 2016, produced 1.7 billion websites. Not only that, but the number of people touched by the internet has grown logarithmically faster and larger than the printed word did, now reaching 4.57 billion people as of July 2020, or nearly 60% of the world's population. Where the printing press's impact was regional, the internet is global, and there has never been anything like this before. Some of you have surely heard this story or joke before. Two young fish are out swimming one morning and they pass by an older fish who says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two fish keep on swimming, and eventually one says to the other, "What the hell is water?" David Foster Wallace used this joke in a commencement address in 2005 and explained that the point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. The internet is such a profound part of our daily lives that it's easy to forget just how much it has changed and in how short of a time. I'm part of the generation that saw the transition from no internet to internet everywhere. I chatted on AIM with friends in high school, but my family's first modem was just a few years earlier, and the PC of my childhood was a Commodore 64. Today, I genuinely don't know how I would keep in touch with my family without the internet, and my entire job depended on it even before COVID. If someone witnesses something from the most trivial to the most profound, that observation can shoot around the world in seconds, in text and in high-fidelity video. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, my phone started going berserk within moments of the announcement hitting the news. And I know way, way more than my 8-year-old self ever imagined about what my friends eat for lunch. 20 years ago, we knew so much less about each other's politics. And today, we end friendships over how someone might or might not be voting. In the blink of an eye, in less than half a generation, we have become a radically, globally enmeshed society. And we weren't ready, because how could we possibly have been ready to know what everyone was thinking every moment of the day? I think about the way that Cerebro is portrayed in the X-Men movies, as basically splitting open the minds of telepathic mutants. And yet this is what the mobile internet has turned us all into. At any given moment, we can warp ourselves into someone else's mind. And that was before the AI showed up. If you think about 3 ingredients, Moore's Law, social media, and AI, you have a thing that I have begun to think of as the Middle Information Age. The Middle Ages were named for a period between the fall of Rome and the beginning of the early modern period in Europe, and as we have established, they were not fun. Plagues, ice ages, war. If you think about what Middle Age means colloquially, it's this uncomfortable liminal period between the rages of youth and the reflection of elderhood, a reconciliation that rarely happens quietly or peacefully, in spite of how happy these stock photo people appear to be. The cake is a lie. I think it's possible that all middle periods are like this, and that we are in one now. I would throw the pin down on the publication of the first website by Tim Berners-Lee as the beginning of this age, and the end is yet to be determined, a new modern period defined by the abundance of scalable social norms and technologies capable of coping with the so-called data tsunami. To acknowledge the Middle Information Age means to change our expectations. We need to stop feeling grief-stricken that things aren't as they were, and start feeling glad and motivated to keep them from being as bad as they could be. Because here's more or less what happened. Moore's Law, if you remember, is the exponential increase in computing power, and we are in the hockey stick end of the curve here. When coupled with social media, keeping everyone online in a constant cycle and drawing more and more people in until we hit a threshold where most of the people a given person knows are on social media, leads to machine learning, the application of radical-scale mathematics to massive data sets, including data created by humans about humans in real time from the social media mesh. The advancement of machine learning into this space of data was certainly inevitable, and indeed the rise of information age led directly to the rise of AI, because only machine learning is capable of deriving insight from this much information. The full impact of machine learning on us is another talk at least, but there's a very important concept for machine learning, and really just statistics and math, that you should know: the overfit. Overfitting is what happens when an algorithm is overtrained on a single data set. For that training data, it becomes too accurate, with the result that it often fails to generalize to other data. Early on in the rapid rise of social media, we noticed that a bubble of sorts was being created, and this was being paralleled in physical society at the same time. There were books about it, but that was before the ML, before the overfitting. When you apply overfitting to social matching algorithms, you get rapid, tight, Ouroboros-like tribe formation, and those tribes move further and further apart. The humans themselves are being overfitted into discrete groups that cannot generalize to the larger population. The best example of this is perhaps QAnon, which by all accounts is a social media-generated super conspiracy formed by melding together many smaller conspiracy groups using optimized social matching algorithms. The leaders of the group used Facebook micro-targeting tools in its advertising service to essentially Katamari ball up thousands of smaller conspiracy theory groups into one giant group that now has instigated violence around the world. This is also, as Kyrie Irving cited when describing how he temporarily became a flat earther, what powers the YouTube rabbit hole. We've got problems, and they are neither as simple nor as apocalyptic as machines running the world. Humans still make the machines, and humans still fundamentally control their meta-level decisions at the end of the day. But the problems spread far beyond social media and the compulsive training and gamification of people for consumer ends, as serious as that in itself is. They're spilling over into society with events like Pizzagate and taking cyber warfare to a whole new level of international espionage and election interference. This echoes the late Middle Ages because Europe at that time was also experiencing a catastrophic collapse of trust in social systems, and that collapse was grounded in a new level of visibility. Whereas in the past, trust was managed hierarchically, trust your church, trust your king, they'll handle the rest, regular people now had access to the written works of everyone. Where before information would burn out within a few conversations in a village, now it could be written down and sent around the world. Sound familiar? And speaking of familiarity, that old adage, familiarity breeds contempt, in the late Middle Ages they were living this reality, and we're living it again now. Now that we have access to every thought of every person, posted instantly on internet-connected devices in their pockets, we are in a new storm of information and can no longer exist in the comfortable, ignorant belief that everyone agrees with us or holds beliefs that we find basically reasonable. And now that the internet allows us to instantly reorganize our social groups, we are deconstructing the notion of what a nation is. The notion that not everyone thinks the way we think, or the way we think they think, is deeply, fundamentally disturbing. It means that our world model is incorrect. And that's what so much of the internet now is, with everyone's thoughts in it. It is a constant confrontation with a cognitive dissonance about how people work. Over and over, the internet is telling us of our deeply held, values-driven beliefs about right and wrong, that when it comes to others with whom we supposedly share a nation, we are wrong, we are wrong, we are wrong. Our brains don't deal well with this kind of cognitive dissonance when it comes to the social organism. In order to consent to exist in society with others, we need to believe that those others are like us, are reasonable, are trustworthy. When we are constantly confronted with these micro-reminders that they are not, our basic trust in the fabric of society unravels. The way through to the other side is to do the work of inspecting our own beliefs, inspecting the foreign beliefs of others, and thoughtfully integrating the two, whether by sensibly rejecting the external beliefs through a conscientious and reasoned process, or incorporating the beliefs into our own world model and changing. But this is hard work, and it can only be done when we feel safe and have the energy to do so. Most of the time we don't. So we, often not even aware that this is what we're doing, flee back into the arms of those who are also in collective denial about this cognitive dissonance. We seek the validation of those who feel as we do without changing, and because this feeling of belonging gives us an oxytocin hit that keeps us engaged with online platforms, these platforms help us accelerate this retreat. The problem is, this retreat makes us vulnerable to nationalism, to despotism, to extremism, and also to despair. This is a new dark age, and the expectations we should set for ourselves about the acceleration into the middle information age should not have anything to do with the world that we came from, the world that we grew up in. We should be trying to limit the number of people who die, and we should be trying to avert as many wars as we can, with the understanding that neither of these numbers will be even close to zero. Here's the upside. There is a future coming where we use the incredible processing power we now have access to create layers of organization and scaffolding that bring us back together. Although the information age is allowing us to capture, view, and communicate what has been trapped inside of small communities prior to this, it isn't fundamentally creating discord, it's just exposing what was already there. And so as a society, we can begin to really confront it, really process it, and maybe really heal it if we can make our society strong by rebuilding trust, especially trust in a common idea of truth and human value. So now I want to talk about video games. But first, take a cat break. Take a deep breath, take in the kitties, and let's continue. You might be wondering what all this has to do with video games, and the answer is, of course, a lot. The answer lives inside another question. Are games art, or are they technology? If you'll excuse a brief blast from the past, back when I was a mud hobbyist, I played muds on a network called Godlike Productions. Godlike had this very clever animated GIF, back when such things were incredible, mysterious luxuries, that featured this Arthur C. Clarke quote, and the magic and the technology would slowly fade in and out and switch places. I think that says so much about what games are. As I said before, I think you should think about video games as information machines whose result is art. That is an incredibly special thing. A video game is made out of logic. It simulates a kind of reality, even if that reality is not the one we live in. It is immersive, but it is also built to persuade and to beguile. But the atoms it fundamentally manipulates are information atoms, as is the case with all art. The result of true art is also the creation of meaning. Video games are special because they represent an experiential art form that understands technology. One of the inescapable aspects of the Middle Information Age is that it represents a challenge for liminal people to stand up and exert their influence. In a world where we have created 1,000 bubbles spread far apart from each other, the disciplines that sit on the edges of those bubbles are critically important because they can be the bridge builders. It is an age of synthesizers, an age of cross-disciplinarians, a return to the rise of the polymaths. Game developers are such people. What's more, video games themselves fuse the systemic nature of software with the expressive subconscious power of art. Games are ontology machines, experiential information architectures that create realities, and are fundamentally grounded in engineering. When games and game developers are at their best, they are empathic, modeling social systems and understanding them from a high-level view, and reasoned, seeing stories not just from a single side, but multidimensionally and intersectionally. When I say that games are ontology machines, I mean that they assert beliefs about the truth of reality in this incredibly unique way, being composed of puzzle pieces that must all fit together and form a holistic, cohesive whole out of individually coded parts. A painting, by contrast, exerts its statement about truth across 2 dimensions. That's not to say that games are superior to paintings, but they are significantly different. If games are both technology and art, and if what art does is create meaning, how do we create meaning from technology? This is the question I think we should be asking, and it isn't possible to overstate its importance in our current time, because the world of technology itself is experiencing a crisis of meaning. Hearts and minds are changed not from facts, but from art. Games, therefore, have an obligation to be a critical bridge, creating meaning from technology. Clearly, the absence of that meaning is not only creating fear of technology, but it's now pulling apart the very fabric that connects our society. We can make a difference against that problem because of our fluency with technology, and because of our fearlessness as creators of art. I should throw out another anecdote here because of how often art is used. We like to create dystopias, especially recently, and it reminds me of what one of my favorite authors, the science fiction author James Morrow, said about dystopias once, despite having himself committed the crime of dystopia a few times, I would say, but that's another topic. Dystopia is in a family with horror and pornography in that it can appeal to the uncontrollable subconscious in us, the lizard brain. Sometimes this is important because it can have a cathartic effect, or an empowering one in embracing the truth of ourselves without judgment. But one should be careful with dystopia, lest it veer away from meaning and descend into nihilism and cynicism. Despite the bleakness suggested by a dark age of middle information, I think we have a lot of reason for hope. I don't think we are headed for 300 years of war, in part because the social progress experienced just in the last generation has been so remarkable. If we step back just a bit, it's incredible to me to think that California could go from claim jumpers and anti-miscegenation laws to sanctuary cities in the span of a single lifetime, my grandmother's lifetime. Here's where I think we could be headed as we break through to the post-information age, an age of respect. As we have new visibility into the truth experienced by people, we are rapidly developing norms of how to make space for those truths and how to move beyond a zero-sum thinking about experience. One person's experience does not negate another's, and societies are not cultural monoliths. To do this, we must embrace a new kind of thinking and accept that we don't know the myriad details of another person's experience, and that's okay. We can learn to really listen. An age of grief. As we recognize these truths, that recognition becomes retroactive as well, and so we must embrace a new reckoning with the past that is more honest and less mythological. We must systematize and normalize this grief, make space for it, and process it. An age of loss. As we have to learn how to slow down in terms of climate, we need to pump the brakes or we would hit the wall called fossil fuel diminishing returns. We must learn what no species on Earth has ever truly learned to do: how to stop growing, how to value optimization, and how to value slowness. And finally, an age of resilience. As we become a species that can be deliberate about its growth, rather than mindlessly turning the mouse wheel of survival of the fittest, consumption and destruction, as we move from 4X to sustainability, we can learn to value resilience and nurture it in ourselves and our communities. We can value the small and optimal. The Middle Ages get a bad rap, as Barbara Tuchman would tell you. They experience tremendous suffering, but they also are ages of contemplation, ages of growth, ages of innovation. They are times when we see clearly that we can do better, that we must do better. We don't yet know how, but we can see the gap that must be crossed. And in this, there is an authenticity. Humanity is not at its best when it runs unchallenged, and in the solutions to some of the darkest times in human history, we find humanity at its very best. This is a compelling story that deserves to be told, and it deserves to be played. For makers of art, and especially makers of art who wield technology, I think it's important to stare as clearly as we possibly can at these dynamics, and to work hard to thoughtfully describe what we see happening in society. We ourselves are makers of mirrors, because art reflects back what it sees in society. If we can do that deliberately, we have a potentially tremendous healing power to bring to bear against our current social crises. We have the opportunity to guide humanity toward a new value set capable of meeting the challenge of the coming generation. Like so much of what I put in front of folks, this is a work in progress, and I'm asking you to help me continue it with your thoughts and comments. If we're going to build a value set, an easy way to think about that is in terms of virtues and vices. So here are some that have been on my mind lately. When we specifically contrast these things, we should be working towards creating a kind of holistic design for a new way of thinking and being. Vices don't mean that we never do these things, but when we do indulge in exerting authority or placing blame or ascribing credit to a single individual or pouring years into monolithic works created in a vacuum, we should be skeptical, we should hesitate. By audience constellation, I mean viewing people not as single cultures, but as many interrelated cultures. And the things desired by these cultures may sometimes overlap, but also may sometimes be in direct opposition. Many effects cascade from this balance of values. And I'll say again that we need to move beyond blame, which clouds our ability to see and build solutions. As Einstein said, the problems of the future cannot be solved with the thinking of the present. If we give in to fear, despair, and cynicism, if we promote these things with our art, we are aiming ourselves at the past, and that way lies extinction. The algorithms driving today's advancements do what they were designed to do. They organize the internet. If you step off the ledge in a direction, the algorithm will keep taking you in that direction, defined by the footprints of those who have clicked before you. They are scaffolds into a kind of mathematically defined perfection, and as such, they are powerful, but like all powerful things, they require our social systems, our laws, our values, to advance to accommodate them. Finally, what does this all suggest that we need? The solution space, I think, consists of investing in new social infrastructure, in regulatory bodies, in those self-reinforcing systems such as communities that create social trust. Only with this fabric can we have the resilience as a society to buffer the immense power and speed of the machine-accelerated internet. And if we can balance that system, so many advances are unlocked, in social progress, in science and medicine, in education. In this way, the accelerated internet empowers us to become more human, and it is in human connection and resilience that we must invest and build new modern structures. If you're receiving this and you're still with me, I both implore and challenge you to think about what the world needs right now, what technology needs, and how we can translate those needs into stories that show the path forward through this dark age. The answers are out there among us. I'm a researcher, albeit perhaps a 2-bit commercial one, and as such I am rarely sure about anything. It's my job to question. But the printing press was undoubtedly a positive influence on humanity. The creation of a more autonomous middle class represented progress for Europe, and the loosening of autocracy and feudalism is positive for the greater good wherever it happens in human history. But these things aren't achieved easily. Gutenberg died with his work largely unknown because its effect would take generations to manifest. There is no portrait of him painted during his lifetime. As we live now in the age of the next printing press, the change we are witnessing is much faster, and we have the potential to recognize new solutions while we still live. If you want to think more about these topics, here are 4 books that triangulate or quadrillate the Middle Information Age. The Fourth Industrial Revolution is the densest I'll give you, but it really does create a contextualized picture of where we are headed in terms of daily life, economics, and work. Project Drawdown is perhaps the most important book you can read for the next 20 years. It describes how we must slow down human societies to survive and thwart catastrophic climate change. Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows is, for me, an oldie but a goodie. If you've seen other talks I give, I laud it regularly. For our modern age, and as a primer in what it takes to start thinking in systems, and therefore thinking in leverage points, and therefore thinking about scalable solutions, it's still the best there is. And it's a fluid, easy read full of transformational concepts. Infomocracy by Malcolm Older is the first in a trilogy, and it's one of the best science fiction novels I've read in the past 5 years. It plays with concepts of the next phase of the information age, with AI, with geopolitics, and a global society. And despite this, it's also just a lot of fun, which is super important. I think it's a great example of how art can wield important ideas that provoke thought and change. Thanks for joining me on this wander through the woods of meaning and technology, and I look forward to further conversation with you all. If you're seeing this in a recording but want to reach out, you can check out my website at erinhoffman.com or reach me on just about any of the usual social media sites. Thank you and be well.